Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere slow and dim and comfortably heavy, the kind of place where time stretches out and nothing is in a hurry. Settle in, let your shoulders drop. Let the long, winding mess of history do what it does best, which is talk quietly until you forget you were ever awake at all. And instead of great battles or clever victories, we're going to drift through something far more consistent and far more human: royal families, mostly broken ones. For centuries, people believed kings were chosen by something divine, that their blood was special, that it was purer, stronger, closer to whatever invisible force supposedly ran the world. And because they believed that, their solution was simple. They kept that blood as close to itself as possible. Brothers married cousins, uncles married nieces. Families folded inward again and again like laundry that never quite dried properly. And of course, they told themselves this was wisdom, tradition, stability. It never occurred to them that maybe this was a very bad idea. So tonight, we're going to begin gently with some of the earliest examples of royal families quietly sabotaging themselves. We won't rush, we won't shock. We'll just observe slowly as generation after generation doubles down on the same mistake, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that crowns do not make you smart. Let's drift back to medieval Europe, a place where medicine was mostly prayer, dietary advice was questionable at best, and family trees were less trees and more complicated knots. One of the earliest dynasties to really commit to the whole, keep it in the family approach was the House of Capet in France. They ruled for centuries, and on paper they were wildly successful. They expanded territory, they strengthened royal authority. They built the foundations of a powerful state, and quietly, in the background, their family genetics were starting to wobble. Marriage for these people was not about affection. It was not even about compatibility. It was a strategic move, a living contract signed with a wedding and sealed with children. The problem was that Europe's royal pool was very small. Everyone important was related to everyone else, usually in more than one way. So even when they thought they were marrying outward, they weren't really. Take King Robert II of France, for example. He was deeply religious, deeply stubborn, and deeply uninterested in being told no. He married his cousin Bertha of Burgundy, not once, but twice. The church objected loudly, basically screamed about it. Incest, they called it. A bad look, they said. Robert responded by pretending not to hear them. Eventually, the church won, but the message was clear: royal blood mattered more than rules. And this pattern repeats constantly. You see it again in England with the Plantagenets. They married into French royalty, who were already related to them, then married back again. Bloodlines overlapped, until even chroniclers seemed a little confused trying to explain who was related to whom without accidentally describing something illegal. What makes this especially tragic is that no one involved was ignorant. They just didn't care. The risks were known, at least in a vague sense. Children born sickly, children who didn't survive, children who did survive but struggled constantly. Yet the solution was never to stop. It was to pray harder, marry closer, and hope God would eventually stop punishing them. And then there were the children, the quiet victims of all this planning. Royal children were often described in glowing terms at birth: strong and healthy and blessed, even when they clearly were not. Chroniclers were paid, after all, and honesty was optional. By the time the truth became impossible to hide, it was usually too late. Let's float over to Spain, where things eventually became legendary for all the wrong reasons, but even early on you can see the warning signs. The Iberian royal families intermarried constantly, especially once kingdoms like Castile and Aragon began aligning themselves. The goal was unity, stability. What they got instead was fragility. Children grew slowly, some never learned to speak properly, some suffered seizures, some were described as endlessly tired, melancholy, or strangely distant. These weren't dramatic failures, they were quiet ones, the kind you notice only after patterns form, and still no one stopped. Royal parents often interpreted these problems as moral or spiritual flaws rather than physical ones. A child was weak because God was testing them. A child was moody because they were sinful. A child was sick because the court hadn't prayed enough. This was very convenient because it meant no one ever had to consider the obvious explanation. As dynasties grew more entangled, the idea of pure blood became less about strength and more about control. Marriage outside the elite was unthinkable, not just socially, but cosmically. The world itself, they believed, depended on kings remaining kings and peasants remaining peasants, and blood was the mechanism that enforced that order. Of course, biology does not care about symbolism. Bodies fail quietly, they falter, they inherit things no crown can fix, and the more tightly these families clung to themselves, the more obvious the damage became. By the late medieval period, you start to see rulers who are technically adults but functionally dependent, kings who cannot rule without constant guidance, queens who struggle through endless miscarriages, courts filled with whispers that everyone pretends not to hear. And still, the marriages continue, because stopping would mean admitting that centuries of decisions were wrong, and royals were very good at many things, but self-reflection was not one of them. What's almost soothing about this, from a distance, is how predictable it all becomes. Genealogies tighten, health declines, blame shifts to fate or God or vague enemies, and the next generation repeats the process with slight variations, convinced they'll be the exception. As we move forward, the names will change, the crowns will change, the countries will change, but the pattern stays exactly the same. People with immense power, very little accountability, and an absolute refusal to marry anyone who isn't already in the family album. And that's where we'll linger for now, in this early stage, where the warning signs are present but ignored, where dynasties still believe they are untouchable, and where history is already quietly clearing its throat. The marriages kept happening quietly, almost politely, as if repeating them often enough would make them harmless. A prince would be born, his lineage celebrated more loudly than his health, and everyone would nod along and say this was normal. This was how it had always been, and that belief alone carried them forward for generations. If you listen closely to medieval records, you can almost hear the exhaustion beneath the praise. Children described as delicate, wives described as frail, men described as thoughtful, when what they really were was chronically unwell or mentally overwhelmed. But language softened everything. A king was never weak. He was contemplative. A queen was never sick. She was pious and withdrawn. Every flaw was gently wrapped in acceptable words, so no one had to confront the pattern forming right in front of them. In Austria, this approach eventually reached an almost artistic level of denial. The early Habsburgs were not yet the caricature they would later become, but the foundations were already there. They married cousins, then married cousins of cousins, and slowly built a family tree that bent back toward itself like it was trying to hide something. The goal was land, power, contracts sealed with weddings. The cost was paid by children who struggled to chew, to speak, to grow normally. At first it was subtle, a slightly elongated face, a jaw that didn't quite sit right, a child who drooled longer than expected. These things were not discussed openly. They were corrected with portraits angled just so, with flattering descriptions written by loyal courtiers. And for a while, it worked. But bodies remember what paperwork tries to forget, and generation by generation, the signs grew harder to disguise. Children survived infancy but never thrived. Adults ruled but needed constant support. Kings relied heavily on advisors, not out of wisdom, but necessity. And the courts adjusted around them, building systems to prop up rulers who were technically sovereign but practically fragile. What's strangely calming about this is how methodical it all feels. No chaos, no sudden collapse, just a slow narrowing of possibility. The more these families restricted who could marry whom, the more limited their future became, not politically but biologically. And still, they insisted this was strength. Let's drift toward England again, where royal bloodlines tangled themselves through alliances with France and Spain and back again. The Wars of the Roses are often remembered for violence, but underneath all of that was a quieter issue: children who died young, mothers who lost pregnancy after pregnancy, men who inherited crowns but not stability. Henry VI is a particularly gentle example. He was king, but not really. He suffered long periods of withdrawal, what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, but which his contemporaries interpreted as divine mystery. He was calm, deeply religious, and completely unfit for the demands placed upon him. This was not a sudden failure. This was the result of generations stacking similar traits on top of each other and hoping for a miracle. And instead of adjusting, the solution was always the same. Produce an heir, marriage will fix it. A child will stabilize everything, because nothing says stability like handing absolute power to a bloodline that is visibly struggling to function. Across Europe, royal nurseries became quiet places, not because children were well-behaved, but because many simply didn't have the energy to be loud. They were watched constantly, fed carefully, prayed over endlessly, and still, many did not survive beyond childhood. The ones who did often carried lifelong illnesses that shaped their personalities and their reigns. Queens bore much of the blame, of course. They always did. If a child was sick, it was her fault. If there was no child, it was her body. If there were too many daughters, that too was somehow her doing. No one questioned the father's genetics. No one questioned the structure that made these marriages inevitable. By the late medieval period, dispensations from the church became routine. Special permissions to marry close relatives were granted so frequently they barely felt special anymore. Incest was no longer a scandal. It was paperwork, a signature, a formality, and every approval nudged these families further into the same narrow corridor. And what's remarkable is how calmly everyone accepted it. Courts adjusted expectations. They planned reigns around limitations. They appointed regents early. They created councils to rule in place of kings who could not. And the public, largely excluded from these inner truths, was told stories of divine will and sacred blood. As time moved forward, portraits became more important than reality. Artists perfected the skill of selective honesty. A weak chin could be softened. A distant gaze could be made noble. A body that struggled to stand could be painted seated on a throne, looking serene. And for those who never met the monarch in person, the image became the truth. But behind those images were lives lived carefully, slowly, and often painfully. Royal routines were built around rest, avoidance, medical interventions that did little more than comfort. The grandeur of court masked an underlying fragility that no crown could cure. And still the marriages continued, because changing course would have meant opening the gates, opening the bloodline, inviting outsiders, and that was more terrifying to these families than illness, than death, than decline. So they stayed closed, they stayed convinced, and history continued its quiet work, layer by layer, marriage by marriage, child by child, building toward outcomes that felt inevitable long before they were ever acknowledged. And we simply keep drifting forward through it, watching dynasties age poorly under the weight of their own traditions, never rushing, never shouting, just letting the long consequences of royal choices unfold at their own unbothered pace. Eventually, the children who did survive learned very early how to be still, not just physically, but emotionally. They were raised in environments where excess feeling was inconvenient. A sickly child was expected to be grateful. A fragile heir was expected to behave with dignity. Breakdowns happened quietly, behind closed doors, and were never recorded honestly. Take Spain for a moment, where the Habsburg experiment reached its most concentrated form. Charles II was born into a family tree that had folded in on itself so tightly it barely resembled a tree anymore. He was fragile from the beginning, delayed in walking, delayed in speaking, plastered with prayers and relics and medical advice that ranged from useless to actively harmful. But no one ever said the obvious, that this was not bad luck, this was design. His court functioned like a protective shell. Servants dressed him, carried him, managed his day in careful increments. His role was symbolic. He was Spain, but Spain moved without him, and everyone pretended this was fine. Marriage was attempted, of course, because tradition demanded it, and because even the most visibly unwell monarch was still expected to produce an heir. Both marriages failed. Not politically, they succeeded there, but biologically nothing happened. And with that, the dynasty quietly reached its end, not with a battle, not with rebellion, just with a body that could no longer carry the weight placed on it. France took a slightly different approach. They spread their risks more widely, but the results were familiar. Children were born healthy enough, then faded. Women endured endless pregnancies because producing a spare was considered an obligation, not a choice. Infant mortality was treated as background noise. Grief was private. Public life continued uninterrupted. Louis XIV outlived nearly all of his legitimate heirs, not because he was especially healthy, but because time was simply relentless. His children and grandchildren died one by one, leaving the crown to a great-grandchild who was barely old enough to understand what was happening. That child would grow into Louis XV, and he would inherit not just a kingdom, but the accumulated exhaustion of generations. By the 18th century, royal doctors were deeply involved in daily life. They monitored digestion, sleep, appetite, moods, but their treatments were based on theories that often worsened the very conditions they were trying to manage: bloodletting, purging, strict diets. A king feeling faint was bled. A queen feeling anxious was sedated. A child not thriving was prayed over and restrained. And still, no one questioned the system. Royal women aged quickly, not because they lived hard lives, but because their bodies were pushed beyond reasonable limits. Early marriage, repeated childbirth, little recovery time. When they became ill, it was framed as weakness rather than consequence. And when they died young, the court mourned briefly before shifting focus to the next marriage. Across Germany, the patchwork of small states followed the same patterns. Cousins married cousins to keep borders tidy. Princesses were exchanged like careful investments. And when children were born with visible issues, they were quietly managed, not hidden entirely, just explained away. Some became intensely religious, others withdrawn, some prone to sudden rages or long silences. These traits were interpreted morally rather than medically. A melancholy prince was reflective, an unstable duke was passionate, language again doing the work of protection. What's almost soothing about all this is how predictable it becomes. Once you recognize the rhythm, you can see the outcome before it arrives. Marriage too close, child frail, reign dependent on advisors, no heir, succession crisis, repeat. And through it all, the aesthetic remained immaculate. The palaces were beautiful, the clothing intricate, the rituals precise. The external order was so perfect it masked the internal collapse for centuries. Even when Enlightenment ideas began to circulate, challenging superstition and tradition, royal households lagged behind. Science advanced slowly inside palaces. Change threatened hierarchy, and hierarchy was the one thing these families were determined to preserve, even if it meant preserving themselves into extinction. Children continued to be born into expectation rather than care. They were taught posture before play, restraint before curiosity. They learned that their bodies belonged to the state, their marriages to diplomacy, and their feelings to no one at all. And when they failed to meet those expectations, when illness or temperament interfered, the response was never compassion, it was management. So we drift onward, through generations that looked increasingly similar, not just in portraits, but in pattern, same names, same alliances, same mistakes, polished endlessly by tradition until decline felt like destiny rather than consequence. And the courts kept whispering reassurance to themselves: this is normal, this is noble, this is how it has always been. Until eventually, it was. The end rarely announced itself loudly. It crept in through paperwork, through councils, through quiet meetings held behind heavy doors. There was no moment where everyone agreed this had gone too far. There never is. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance that things were limited, that options were fewer, that the future would require creative explanations. In many courts, the solution became delay. If an heir was weak, they waited. If a queen failed to conceive, they waited. If a king was clearly unfit, they waited. And waiting became policy. Time was stretched like fabric pulled thin over a frame that could no longer support it. Some monarchs lived long lives not because they were healthy, but because they were carefully protected. They avoided travel, they avoided stress, they avoided decisions. The machinery of state moved around them like water around a stone. This created the illusion of continuity even as vitality drained away. And then there were the royal children who survived but never escaped scrutiny. Every cough was noted, every fever recorded, every emotional shift watched closely. They grew up aware that their bodies were being evaluated constantly, that love was conditional, that survival itself was a performance. Tutors adjusted lessons for those who could not concentrate. Servants learned routines that compensated for physical weakness. Courtiers learned which topics to avoid. Entire households adapted around the limitations of a single person while insisting that person was exceptional. This environment produced a particular kind of personality. Some became intensely controlled, rigid to the point of fragility. Others withdrew into routine, repeating the same actions day after day, because unpredictability was exhausting. And some broke quietly, losing themselves in rituals or religion or silence. Marriage remained the expected cure. It always did. A new spouse would bring balance, vitality, fresh blood, without actually being fresh at all, because alliances mattered more than outcomes. And so cousins continued marrying cousins, just from slightly farther branches this time, as if distance on paper could undo proximity in practice. Royal women often sensed this more clearly than anyone. They lived inside the consequences. They carried pregnancies that failed again and again. They watched children weaken despite every precaution, and they were expected to keep smiling, to keep hosting, to keep producing. Some resisted quietly, delaying marriages, feigning illness, withdrawing from court life. These acts were framed as eccentricities or piety rather than self-preservation. But resistance had limits, and the system always found ways to reassert itself. By the time cracks became visible to outsiders, it was already too late. The public noticed instability without understanding its origins. They blamed advisors, they blamed religion, they blamed foreign influence. They rarely blamed the structure itself. And when revolutions eventually came, as they always do, they were often reacting to symptoms, not causes. The weak kings, the indecisive courts, the disconnected elites. But beneath all of that was a long biological exhaustion that had been centuries in the making. What remains fascinating is not that these dynasties fell, but that they lasted as long as they did, sustained by ceremony, by habit, by belief, and by a shared refusal to acknowledge that bloodlines, like any living thing, require variation to survive. Instead, they curated sameness, they prized familiarity, they feared dilution, and in doing so they slowly narrowed themselves into fragility. As we continue drifting through this history, it becomes less about individuals and more about patterns, the same choices repeating with minor variations, the same justifications, the same quiet consequences. And the story keeps moving not toward drama, but toward inevitability, slowly, softly, without urgency, because collapse does not always roar. Sometimes its size settles and goes still. And so we stay here floating through these lives, not to judge, not to rush, but simply to observe how power, tradition, and denial can coexist for astonishing lengths of time before reality gently insists on being noticed. In some families, the pattern became so familiar it stopped being frightening. It was simply expected that not every child would thrive, that some would be delicate, that some would never quite grow into the role imagined for them. And rather than prompting change, this expectation created a kind of emotional numbness. Nurseries were full yet strangely quiet. Children were dressed carefully, taught manners early, and reminded constantly of their place. They learned not to ask too many questions, not to complain, not to expect comfort. They were loved in theory, but managed in practice. When a child showed promise, it was celebrated cautiously, always with the awareness that promise could fade overnight. A fever, an infection, an accident, none of these were rare, and so hope was rationed. Royal parents often kept a measured distance, not because they lacked feeling, but because attachment carried risk. Loving deeply meant risking devastation. And in a world where loss was frequent, restraint became a survival strategy. This emotional economy shaped entire generations. Children raised without warmth became adults who ruled without it. They followed protocol flawlessly, they honored tradition, they maintained appearances, and they struggled quietly with emptiness they could not name. Some sought distraction in hunting, in travel, in collections. Others immersed themselves in ceremony, memorizing every rule, because rules were stable even when bodies were not. And some turned inward, cultivating a private world of thoughts, that no one else was allowed to enter. Courts adjusted their expectations accordingly. They valued predictability over brilliance, stability over innovation. A monarch who did nothing was often preferred to one who did too much. Doing nothing carried less risk. As borders shifted and wars flared, dynasties clung even more tightly to tradition. Change felt dangerous because it was unfamiliar. Familiar problems were at least manageable. Unfamiliar solutions were not. And so marriages continued to be negotiated with little regard for personal compatibility or genetic consequence. All that mattered was alliance. Blood stayed within approved circles, and the same surnames reappeared again and again in family trees that resembled knots more than branches. Physicians noted symptoms but lacked context. They treated headaches, fainting spells, digestive issues, nervous agitation without understanding their shared origin. Each ailment was addressed individually, never as part of a whole, and so treatment remained superficial. Meanwhile, portraiture continued its quiet work of myth-making. Images of serene families, calm rulers, composed children froze moments in time that did not reflect daily reality. These images traveled far beyond palace walls, shaping public perception and reinforcing the illusion of order. But within those walls, daily life required constant adjustment, meals modified, sleep regulated, schedules padded with rest. A king might rule for decades without ever experiencing what we would call a full day of health. And still people bowed, still titles were honored, still rituals unfolded exactly as prescribed. The surface remained smooth even as the structure beneath grew increasingly brittle. What makes this history strangely gentle is its lack of urgency. No one rushed toward disaster. No single decision doomed these families. It was accumulation, repetition, habit. The slow narrowing of options dressed up as continuity. When outsiders married in occasionally, they were absorbed quickly. The system adapted them, not the other way around, and within a generation or two, the old patterns resumed unchanged. The result was a kind of suspended animation, dynasties that existed more as symbols than as living, evolving families. They endured because they were designed to endure, even when endurance came at the cost of vitality. And so time moved forward not with momentum, but with persistence. Courts opened and closed, seasons passed, children were born and buried, alliances signed and forgotten. And the quiet toll continued to accumulate unnoticed by those too close to see it. We remain here watching this unfold slowly, gently letting the rhythm carry us onward through a world where power rested on repetition and survival was never quite the same thing as living. By the time the 19th century arrived, the patterns were so ingrained they barely required enforcement. Children knew what was expected before they were told. They absorbed rules the way others absorbed language. It was simply the air of the palace. Education focused on memory and obedience. History was taught as lineage rather than analysis. The past was a parade of ancestors, not a series of lessons, and every child learned early that their value lay not in who they were, but in how well they represented those who came before. Illness was still common, though now described with slightly more precision. We see references to nerves, to weakness, to constitution. But treatment remained cautious, conservative, restrained. Doctors were advisors, not decision-makers. The final authority was tradition, and tradition rarely approved innovation. Queens especially lived under constant scrutiny. Their bodies were monitored, their cycles noted, their health discussed openly by men who would never experience the risks themselves. A successful birth was praised as duty fulfilled. A failed one was absorbed quietly and then repeated. Grief was acknowledged only briefly. There was no time to dwell, no space for prolonged mourning when political schedules pressed forward. Black clothing was worn, protocol observed, and then life resumed exactly as before. Some royal children grew up remarkably observant. They noticed the silences. They noticed how adults changed tone around certain topics. They learned which names were never spoken, which portraits were rarely displayed. And they understood without being told that survival required discretion. This produced rulers who were cautious to a fault. They avoided strong opinions, they deferred endlessly, they allowed councils to dominate decisions, and they mistook passivity for wisdom because it kept things stable. Stability, however, was fragile. The system functioned only as long as everyone agreed to maintain it. Once cracks appeared, they spread quickly because there was no flexibility left, no resilience built into the structure. Yet even then, courts preferred denial. They blamed individuals rather than acknowledging patterns. A weak king, a difficult queen, a rebellious heir, always the problem was personal, never systemic. And so the cycle continued. Marriage, birth, illness, adaptation, repetition. It became so routine it lost emotional weight. Events blurred together. One sickly child was much like another, one cautious reign much like the last. From the outside, this looked like calm. From the inside, it felt like exhaustion, a weariness that settled into bones and lingered across generations. It is easy to imagine silence filling these spaces, not dramatic silence, just the absence of spontaneity, of laughter, of unpredictability, life regulated until only function remained. And through it all, the belief persisted that this was necessary, that power required sacrifice, that the price of continuity was personal cost. And because this belief was shared, rarely questioned, it endured. So we continue drifting through these centuries, watching the same choices made with slight variations, not because people were foolish, but because they were trapped inside systems that rewarded familiarity and punished change. There is no villain here, no single moment of failure, just a long, slow tightening until movement became difficult and adaptation nearly impossible. And yet the rituals continued. The crowns still shone, the ceremonies still drew crowds, and history rolled forward, carrying these families along even as they grew increasingly disconnected from the world beyond their walls. Over time, even the language of the court adjusted itself. Words softened edged realities, health became delicacy, weakness became sensitivity, limitations became temperament. This careful phrasing allowed everyone to acknowledge problems without ever confronting them directly. Children who struggled were praised for endurance rather than helped to recover. A boy who tired easily was thoughtful. A girl prone to illness was refined. The narrative always bent to preserve dignity, even when dignity came at the cost of honesty. Royal schedules reflected this unspoken truth. Days were short, events limited, travel rare. The appearance of normal function mattered more than actual engagement. And so rulers often ruled from chairs, from carriages, from carefully controlled rooms where variables could be minimized. This produced governance that was cautious by necessity. Decisions were deferred, compromises favored, delay became strategy, not because leaders lacked intelligence, but because their bodies and minds could not sustain constant pressure. The emotional cost of this was immense yet invisible. There was little room for joy, unplanned laughter, or genuine intimacy. Relationships were structured, regulated, observed. Even private moments carried expectation. Marriage rarely offered refuge. Spouses were chosen for compatibility of rank, not temperament. They entered arrangements already burdened with duty, and when affection failed to develop, it was accepted as normal. Some couples lived parallel lives, sharing space, but little else. Others clung to ritual as a substitute for connection, meals at fixed hours, conversations carefully limited, public appearances meticulously choreographed. Children raised in these environments learned to mirror what they saw. They became composed early. They suppressed impulse. They valued control above all else. And while this made them effective symbols, it left little space for personal fulfillment. The wider world moved on, slowly shifting in ways the court only partially registered. New ideas filtered in, softened by tradition until they lost their edge. What remained was reassurance that continuity itself was virtue. And so the system endured, not because it worked well, but because it worked just well enough. Any alternative felt riskier than stagnation. Change threatened exposure. exposure threatened collapse. Those who did attempt reform often found themselves isolated, resisted, quietly undermined, gently redirected back into acceptable paths. The system had many ways of preserving itself without appearing to do so. As decades passed, the sense of exhaustion deepened. It was not always physical, it was institutional, an entire way of life built on restraint, repetition, and denial slowly wearing thin. Yet from the outside, nothing appeared amiss. Courts still gleamed, processions still moved through streets, crowds still watched in awe. The performance remained convincing long after the reality had begun to fade. Inside, however, life felt increasingly narrow. The same conversations, the same concerns, the same careful avoidance of anything unpredictable. And so history continued, not as a series of dramatic turns, but as a long, gentle compression, slowly pressing these families into smaller and smaller spaces, until adaptability became almost impossible. We remain within that quiet compression, letting it carry us forward without pause, without commentary, without resolution, simply observing how continuity can become confinement over time. The rituals persisted because they had always persisted. No one alive remembered their beginning, so no one questioned their necessity. They were performed because yesterday they had been performed, and because tomorrow would expect the same. Every gesture had precedent, every word followed a script. Children memorized etiquette before they understood meaning. They practiced bows and greetings long before they learned how to express discomfort or curiosity. And so the body learned obedience before the mind had a chance to wander. Silence became a skill, a valuable one. Knowing when not to speak carried more weight than knowing what to say. The ability to remain composed through fatigue, boredom, or quiet distress was praised as maturity. Those who failed at this were gently sidelined. They were described as sensitive or unsuited to public life. They were given smaller roles, quieter residences, fewer expectations. This was framed as kindness, though it was really containment. Over time, the court grew adept at absorbing difference without accommodating it. Any deviation was managed, smoothed, reframed, until it no longer disrupted the surface calm. The system did not reject weakness, it domesticated it. Physicians continued to circulate, offering careful observations and cautious advice. They spoke of balance, of rest, of moderation. They recommended calm surroundings, gentle routines, predictable schedules, all of which aligned perfectly with what the court already believed. And so medical language reinforced tradition rather than challenging it. What might have been warning signs became justifications for maintaining the status quo. Royal correspondence from this period reads strangely even, not dramatic, not emotional, just measured, controlled, restrained. Letters discuss births, illnesses, deaths, alliances, all with the same even tone, as if emotional modulation itself was considered unseemly. This shaped memory. History recorded from within these circles often lacks intensity. Events that would have been devastating elsewhere appear muted, flattened by formality. The record preserves order more than experience. Children reading these accounts later learned not what had happened, but how it was supposed to feel, or rather how it was supposed to appear. And so they stepped into roles already defined. They inherited not just titles, but expectations about how much space they were allowed to occupy emotionally, physically, intellectually. Some adapted so well they seemed almost hollow, performing their duties flawlessly while remaining distant even from themselves. Others carried a quiet restlessness, an unnamed dissatisfaction that followed them through life. But restlessness rarely led to action. Action required energy, energy required health, and health was something these families had learned to ration carefully. Instead, small deviations occurred. Private habits, eccentric routines, personal fixations that gave individuals a sense of control. These quirks were tolerated, even indulged, as long as they did not disrupt public function. A king who walked the same route every day, a queen who insisted on exact meal times, a prince who avoided crowds. None of this raised concern, it was simply accommodated. And so the palace adapted around its inhabitants, shaping itself to their limitations, rather than asking them to expand beyond them. This adaptability gave the illusion of resilience, but it was really specialization. The system became excellent at sustaining a narrow range of conditions and increasingly poor at responding to anything outside them. As long as life followed expected rhythms, the court functioned smoothly, but unexpected pressures exposed how little flexibility remained. Still, the belief endured that endurance itself was proof of success, that survival was validation, that if the crown remained, then everything else was secondary. And so time continued its slow movement forward, carrying with it a lineage defined less by vitality than by persistence, shaped by generations of careful management and quiet compromise. Persistence shaped identity so completely that alternatives felt almost unthinkable. To imagine a different way of ruling, a different way of living, required stepping outside everything familiar, and familiarity was the one thing these families trusted. The court rewarded those who maintained equilibrium, not excellence, not creativity, just steadiness. A ruler who avoided scandal and survived his reign without visible collapse was considered successful regardless of what was actually achieved. This standard filtered downward. Heirs were praised for calmness, for restraint, for blending in. They were discouraged from strong preferences. Bold interests were seen as liabilities. Passions implied instability. Education followed suit. Less exploration, more repetition. Less debate, more memorization. The goal was not understanding, but continuity. Knowledge was valued insofar as it preserved existing structures. And so intellectual life within palaces often lagged behind broader cultural shifts. New ideas arrived filtered, stripped of urgency, until they posed no threat. What remained was a sense of being informed without being challenged. The emotional atmosphere grew increasingly thin, polite, cordial, distant. Relationships were maintained through duty rather than affection. Even friendships carried an element of surveillance. Candor was rare. This environment created rulers who were hyper-aware of appearance. Every movement was deliberate, every expression calibrated. Spontaneity felt dangerous because it could not be rehearsed. Health remained a constant, quiet concern. Days were structured to conserve energy. Naps were built into schedules. Exertion was discouraged. These accommodations kept individuals functioning, but never thriving. The irony was that the more carefully life was managed, the more fragile it became. Any deviation from routine carried risk. Any disruption could unravel weeks of careful balance. And so the system doubled down on control, more rules, more predictability, more insulation. This worked for a time, but it also narrowed the margin for survival. As generations passed, the weight of expectation grew heavier because there were fewer examples of success to draw from. The past offered continuity, but little inspiration. Young rulers looked backward rather than forward. They measured themselves against ancestors whose achievements were more symbolic than practical, and they found reassurance in resemblance rather than renewal. Meanwhile, the world beyond palace walls continued to change gradually, relentlessly. Administrative demands grew, populations shifted, economies evolved, but the court moved at its own pace, buffered from urgency. This growing disconnect was not intentional, it was structural. The system was never designed for adaptation, it was designed for preservation. And preservation requires sameness. Sameness requires restraint. Restraint over time becomes exhaustion. So we move forward through these years, feeling that exhaustion settled deeper into the fabric of dynastic life. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just cumulative. The crown still passed from head to head. The ceremonies still marked the transition. But each transfer carried a little less vitality, a little more weight, until endurance itself became the central virtue. And endurance, while impressive, is not infinite. It simply lasts until it doesn't. Endurance shaped every expectation so thoroughly that it replaced curiosity entirely. And in these households, curiosity was seen not as a virtue but as a risk, because questions led to alternatives, and alternatives threatened the delicate balance that had taken generations to construct. So children learned early to accept rather than explore, to repeat rather than invent, and to move carefully through life as though the ground beneath them might crack if they stepped too firmly. This created a peculiar stillness in royal spaces, a calm that felt rehearsed rather than natural, where movement was measured and voices rarely rose, and even moments of celebration carried a muted quality, as if everyone involved understood that excitement was something to be rationed, saved for public display, and never indulged privately. Health continued to dictate behavior in quiet ways, with schedules built around rest, meals designed to be gentle, environments curated for calm. And while this preserved function, it also removed friction. And without friction, there was little growth, only maintenance, only repetition, only the slow wearing down of vitality that no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. Those who sensed this often struggled internally, feeling an unnamed dissatisfaction that could not be expressed without sounding ungrateful. Because from the outside, their lives appeared comfortable, privileged, enviable, and yet comfort without agency slowly hollowed them out, leaving behind individuals who performed roles flawlessly while feeling increasingly detached from them. The court reinforced this detachment by valuing appearance above experience, by praising composure over honesty, and by framing emotional distance as strength. So rulers learned to manage not just their subjects but themselves, monitoring every reaction, filtering every impulse, and presenting a version of stability that required constant vigilance to maintain. Over decades, this vigilance became instinctive, passed down like etiquette, so that even in private moments individuals found it difficult to relax fully, always aware of being observed, even when alone, because the habits of restraint had become internalized, shaping thought as much as behavior. And still the system functioned, which only confirmed its logic, because survival was taken as proof of success, and the fact that these dynasties endured despite their fragility was used to justify the very practices that weakened them, creating a loop where preservation fed decline and decline justified further preservation. Marriages continued to be arranged with careful attention to status and lineage, and though the rhetoric spoke of unity and stability, the lived reality often involved partners who barely knew one another, bound by duty rather than affection, navigating relationships defined by obligation, and raising children within structures that offered security but little warmth. These children grew up observant and cautious, skilled at reading atmospheres, adept at adjusting themselves to expectations, and while this made them effective participants in court life, it left little room for spontaneity, creativity, or genuine self-discovery, qualities that were quietly discouraged because they introduced unpredictability. As time passed, the gap between appearance and experience widened, with the public face of monarchy remaining serene while the private reality grew increasingly constrained, and this dissonance required constant management, further draining energy and reinforcing the preference for routine over innovation. Physicians, advisors, and courtiers all contributed to this equilibrium, each playing their role in sustaining the system, often with good intentions, because change felt dangerous and tradition felt safe, even when tradition had clearly produced diminishing returns. And so life continued in carefully regulated cycles, marked by ceremonies that reaffirmed continuity, births that renewed hope cautiously, and deaths that were absorbed quietly, all woven into a narrative of stability that smoothed over the accumulating costs. Over generations, the emotional texture of these families grew thinner, more restrained, until even joy felt performative and sorrow felt abbreviated, because there was always another obligation waiting, another appearance to manage, another expectation to fulfill. This way of life did not collapse suddenly, nor did it require dramatic failure, because it was never built for flourishing, only for persistence. And persistence can last a very long time, even as it slowly consumes the energy that sustains it. So we drift onward through this extended present, where time feels less like movement and more like repetition, where each generation inherits not just a crown, but a carefully curated way of being, and where the greatest achievement is simply to endure without disrupting the fragile balance that holds everything together. The balance once established became almost sacred, not because it was ideal, but because it was familiar, and familiarity in these circles carried the weight of safety, so anything that resembled stability was preserved even when it produced quiet harm, and anything that hinted at change was treated with suspicion, not openly condemned, but gently redirected until it lost momentum and dissolved back into routine. Over years, this created a strange contradiction where life was tightly controlled, yet deeply uncertain, because despite all the precautions, no one could guarantee health, longevity, or succession, and this underlying uncertainty fed the obsession with order, as if perfect management might finally tame chance itself, even though chance had already proven repeatedly that it did not care for crowns or titles. Children raised within this logic often developed an early awareness of mortality, not in a dramatic sense, but as a background presence, because illness and loss were common enough to be expected, yet never openly discussed, so they learned to sense absence, to notice when rooms emptied quietly, when schedules adjusted without explanation, when names stopped being mentioned altogether. This taught them that disappearance was part of life, and that asking why was unnecessary, and so emotional processing was replaced with acceptance, a kind of resigned calm that served them well in public, but left unresolved tensions quietly accumulating beneath the surface. As these children matured into rulers, they brought that same acceptance into governance, approaching crises not with urgency, but with patience, assuming that most problems would resolve themselves given time and careful management, which sometimes worked and sometimes simply delayed consequences until they became harder to address. The preference for delay shaped political culture profoundly, encouraging incrementalism over decisive action. And while this avoided abrupt disruptions, it also prevented meaningful reform, leaving systems outdated and brittle, increasingly reliant on symbolism rather than effectiveness. Symbolism became the language through which authority was expressed, with ceremonies reinforcing hierarchy and continuity, reminding everyone involved that the structure itself mattered more than the individuals inhabiting it, and that personal discomfort was a small price to pay for the illusion of permanence. Over time, even personal identity became intertwined with role, so that many rulers struggled to imagine themselves outside the framework of duty, finding retirement or abdication unthinkable not because of ambition, but because the role had consumed their sense of self entirely. This lack of separation between person and position made vulnerability particularly dangerous, because admitting weakness felt like undermining the institution itself. So health concerns were minimized, emotions suppressed, and difficulties reframed as temporary inconveniences rather than structural problems. Courtiers played an essential role in maintaining this narrative, carefully shaping information, filtering feedback, and presenting reality in manageable fragments, ensuring that rulers were never overwhelmed by the full complexity of their situation, which preserved function but deepened detachment. Detachment became a defining feature of dynastic life, manifesting as emotional distance, cautious decision-making, and an almost ritualized reluctance to engage deeply with unpredictable elements, whether people, ideas, or events. This detachment extended to family relationships as well, with parents maintaining formal interactions with children, siblings competing quietly for approval, and spouses navigating partnerships defined more by protocol than intimacy, all of which reinforced the sense that personal connections were secondary to institutional needs. Yet despite this restraint, human impulses persisted, surfacing in subtle ways through habits, routines, and preferences that provided individuals with small pockets of control, whether through meticulous attention to detail, rigid adherence to schedules, or personal rituals that offered comfort amid uncertainty. These habits were often interpreted as eccentricities and tolerated as long as they remained contained, further illustrating the system's ability to absorb deviation without truly accommodating it, preserving the surface calm while managing underlying tension. As decades turned into centuries, the cumulative effect of this management became increasingly visible in the fragility of rulers, the narrowness of their experiences, and the predictability of their responses, creating a lineage characterized less by innovation than by repetition. Repetition reinforced belief, belief justified practice, and practice perpetuated repetition, forming a closed loop that was difficult to break because it lacked obvious points of failure, functioning adequately even as it slowly eroded resilience. Observers from outside these circles sometimes noted the peculiar stillness of court life, the way time seemed to move differently within palace walls, measured by ceremonies rather than seasons, by protocol rather than progress. But these observations rarely penetrated deeply enough to prompt change. Inside the system, change was often framed as disruption, something to be avoided unless absolutely necessary, and even then implemented cautiously, incrementally, and often reluctantly, ensuring that the core structure remained intact. This cautious approach extended to succession planning, where uncertainty about heirs prompted elaborate contingencies, marriages arranged to hedge against risk, and alliances formed to stabilize transitions, all of which added layers of complexity without addressing underlying fragility. The emphasis on lineage and blood reinforced the belief that continuity depended on sameness, discouraging diversity and reinforcing insularity, which further limited adaptability and increased vulnerability to unexpected challenges. As the wider world evolved, introducing new social, economic, and political dynamics, the court's insulated rhythm grew increasingly out of sync, creating a widening gap between symbolic authority and practical influence. Yet this gap did not immediately threaten the institution because symbolism carried its own power, shaping perceptions, legitimizing rule, and providing a sense of order even when effectiveness waned. The reliance on symbolism allowed dynasties to persist through periods of weakness, but it also delayed necessary adjustments, making eventual reckonings more complex and less manageable. Throughout this long arc of history, individual experiences varied widely, with some rulers finding moments of satisfaction within the constraints, others struggling quietly, and a few attempting to push boundaries only to encounter resistance, but the overall pattern remained remarkably consistent. Consistency was both strength and weakness, providing stability while limiting growth, enabling endurance while undermining vitality, and fostering a culture where survival was prioritized over flourishing. This culture shaped not only rulers but entire institutions, influencing administrative practices, social norms, and political expectations, embedding restraint and caution into the fabric of governance. Over time, the language of duty overshadowed the language of possibility, narrowing the scope of what was considered achievable, acceptable, or even imaginable within the system. As a result, dynastic life became increasingly inward-focused, concerned with maintaining equilibrium rather than engaging with broader realities, and this inward focus further reinforced isolation. Isolation protected the system from immediate disruption, but also deprived it of feedback, making it harder to recognize when adaptation was necessary and easier to misinterpret persistence as success. The gradual nature of this process meant that no single generation felt responsible for the accumulated constraints, each inheriting a structure already shaped by past decisions and continuing it with minor adjustments, believing they were preserving tradition rather than perpetuating limitation. This diffusion of responsibility made change unlikely, because no individual action appeared decisive enough to justify risk, and collective inertia favored continuity. As years passed, the emotional tone of court life grew increasingly muted, characterized by polite interactions, measured responses, and an overarching emphasis on control, which further distanced individuals from their own experiences. Yet within this muted landscape, moments of genuine feeling still occurred, often fleeting and private, quickly subsumed by routine, leaving behind faint impressions rather than lasting change. These moments hinted at the human cost of the system, but without mechanisms for acknowledgement or integration, they faded quietly, reinforcing the cycle of suppression and adaptation. In this way, dynasties persisted not through vitality, but through careful management of decline, extending their existence by smoothing over cracks rather than addressing foundations. This strategy proved effective for long stretches, allowing institutions to endure across centuries, but it also ensured that when challenges eventually exceeded the system's capacity to adapt, responses would be constrained by the very habits that had sustained it. Still, within the slow rhythm of dynastic time, urgency remained rare, and life continued in its familiar patterns, each generation stepping into roles defined long before their birth, carrying forward expectations shaped by history rather than choice. And so the story unfolds not as a sequence of dramatic turning points, but as a continuous flow of repetition, adjustment, and endurance, where the absence of collapse is mistaken for health, and continuity itself becomes the ultimate measure of success, even as the underlying vitality quietly ebbs away. This quiet ebbing of vitality rarely alarmed those living within it, because they had no reference point for anything else. Having been born into a world where restraint was normal, emotional distance was polite, and survival itself was treated as an achievement. So the absence of joy or curiosity did not feel like loss, but simply like life as it was meant to be lived, orderly, controlled, and predictable. From childhood onward, they were trained to read subtle cues, to sense shifts in mood, to recognize when a conversation should end before it truly began. And this sensitivity made them excellent navigators of court life while simultaneously exhausting them, because constant vigilance leaves little room for rest, even in environments designed for calm. Rest itself became a managed activity, scheduled and supervised, taken not when needed, but when permitted, reinforcing the idea that even the body belonged to the system rather than the individual, a tool to be maintained rather than experienced. As rulers aged, this relationship with the body grew more complicated, with aches and limitations accommodated quietly, adjustments made without acknowledgement, and the expectation that authority should remain unaffected by physical decline, further widening the gap between appearance and reality. This gap required careful maintenance, and entire layers of court life existed solely to preserve it, from controlled access to the ruler, to curated information, to carefully staged appearances that reassured observers without revealing vulnerability. Over time, these mechanisms became self-perpetuating, creating an environment where truth was not hidden maliciously, but filtered gently, shaped into forms that could be absorbed without causing disruption, reinforcing a shared understanding that stability mattered more than accuracy. This understanding extended to history itself, which was recorded selectively, emphasizing continuity and legitimacy while minimizing conflict and failure, producing narratives that reinforced belief in the system and discouraged critical reflection. Future generations inherited these narratives as truth, learning about their ancestors through sanitized accounts that celebrated endurance while obscuring cost, leaving them ill-equipped to recognize repeating patterns or imagine alternatives. Imagination, when it surfaced, often took the form of nostalgia rather than innovation, idealizing a past that never truly existed while overlooking the structural constraints that shaped it, further anchoring the present to inherited assumptions. The daily rhythms of palace life reinforced this anchoring, with meals, audiences, and ceremonies occurring at fixed intervals, creating a sense of timelessness that blurred distinctions between years, decades, and even centuries. In such an environment, change felt almost abstract, something that happened elsewhere beyond the walls, while inside life followed a familiar script that rarely varied, offering comfort through repetition even as it limited growth. This comfort was seductive, particularly for those burdened by responsibility, because it promised predictability in a world where unpredictability could carry significant consequences, making routine a refuge rather than a constraint. Yet routine also dulled perception, making it harder to notice gradual shifts, whether in public sentiment, economic conditions, or the health of the institution itself, allowing small problems to accumulate unnoticed until they became entrenched. The system's reliance on advisors further complicated this dynamic, as layers of counsel buffered rulers from direct engagement with reality, providing interpretation rather than experience, and reinforcing the belief that mediation was preferable to immediacy. Advisors themselves were products of the same culture, trained to value caution and continuity, and so their guidance often mirrored existing preferences, reinforcing rather than challenging established patterns. This created a feedback loop where decision-making became increasingly conservative, prioritizing the avoidance of error over the pursuit of opportunity, which preserved stability but limited progress. Progress, when it occurred, tended to be incremental and technical, focusing on administrative efficiency rather than substantive reform, ensuring that underlying structures remained intact even as surface details evolved. These incremental changes gave the impression of movement while maintaining the core logic of the system, allowing dynasties to adapt superficially without confronting deeper issues. As a result, adaptability became synonymous with preservation rather than transformation, reinforcing the idea that survival depended on minimizing disruption rather than embracing change. This philosophy influenced not only governance but personal behavior, encouraging individuals to suppress desires that might lead them outside accepted roles, and to channel ambition into socially sanctioned forms that reinforced hierarchy. Ambition, when permitted, was often redirected toward maintaining the institution rather than reshaping it, ensuring that personal success aligned with systemic continuity. Those who struggled with this alignment experienced quiet frustration, sensing that their lives were constrained by expectations they did not choose, yet lacking the language or authority to challenge them. This frustration rarely erupted into open conflict, instead manifesting as withdrawal, apathy, or quiet resignation, further contributing to the muted emotional landscape of court life. Over generations, these patterns produced a lineage characterized by composure and restraint, admired for its dignity, yet increasingly disconnected from lived experience, and this disconnect subtly undermined legitimacy even as appearances remained intact. Legitimacy depended not only on tradition, but on resonance, the ability of rulers to embody shared values and experiences, and as the gap widened between court and society, this resonance weakened. Yet the weakening was gradual, masked by ceremony and habit, making it difficult to pinpoint when confidence began to erode, because there was no single moment of failure, only a slow drift. This drift was felt most acutely in private, in moments of solitude where individuals confronted the limitations of their roles, sensing that something essential was missing without being able to articulate what it was. Such moments were fleeting, often interrupted by duty and rarely shared, reinforcing isolation and preventing collective recognition of systemic issues. Isolation was both a consequence and a cause of the system's endurance, protecting it from immediate challenge while deepening its detachment from reality. As time passed, the rituals that once reinforced unity began to feel hollow, performed out of obligation rather than belief, yet still repeated because repetition itself had become the foundation of authority. The meaning behind these rituals shifted subtly, from expressions of shared purpose to demonstrations of continuity, signaling that the institution persisted regardless of individual conviction. This shift made it easier for individuals to participate without engagement, to perform roles without internalizing their significance, further hollowing out the emotional core of dynastic life. Despite this hollowing, the structure remained impressive, its longevity lending it an aura of inevitability that discouraged dissent and reinforced acceptance. Acceptance became the dominant emotional response, replacing hope, fear, or ambition, and this acceptance allowed individuals to navigate constrained lives with minimal friction, even as it limited fulfillment. Fulfillment was rarely discussed, because the concept itself implied personal desire, which was subordinate to duty, and so happiness was framed not as joy but as contentment with one's role. Contentment was achieved through adjustment rather than satisfaction, by lowering expectations and aligning oneself with what was possible rather than what was desirable. This psychological adaptation was effective, enabling individuals to function within narrow parameters, but it also reinforced the system by reducing pressure for change. Over centuries, this adaptation became tradition, passed down as wisdom, shaping advice given to heirs and reinforcing the belief that endurance was the highest virtue. The cumulative effect of this belief was a culture that prized survival over vitality, continuity over creativity, and stability over growth, ensuring that dynasties could persist long after their capacity for renewal had diminished. Yet even within this culture, life continued, complex and nuanced, with moments of connection, satisfaction, and meaning emerging despite constraints, reminding us that individuals are more than the systems they inhabit. These moments, however, were personal and transient, leaving the broader structure unchanged, and so the long arc of dynastic history continued its slow trajectory, defined less by transformation than by persistence. Persistence allowed institutions to weather storms, but it also ensured that when storms intensified, the capacity to respond creatively was limited, constrained by habits formed in quieter times. As external pressures gradually increased, the contrast between the court's insulated rhythm and the world's accelerating pace became more pronounced, highlighting the limitations of a system designed for preservation rather than adaptation. Yet within the palace walls, life continued much as it always had, marked by routine, ceremony, and careful management, sustaining the illusion of timelessness even as circumstances evolved. This illusion was powerful, shaping perception and reinforcing belief, making it difficult to imagine an end to a way of life that had existed for so long and had outlasted so many challenges. And so the story continues, not toward resolution or climax, but onward through repetition and gradual change, carrying forward the accumulated weight of tradition, expectation, and endurance, as dynasties persist through careful management of decline, sustained by belief in continuity and the quiet acceptance of limitation. Over time, this quiet acceptance hardened into instinct, and instinct shaped behavior more effectively than any rule ever could. Because when something is learned without being questioned, it becomes invisible, and invisibility is the most powerful form of control, guiding choices without ever announcing itself, shaping lives without appearing to interfere. Children raised in this environment grew into adults who rarely experienced internal conflict in obvious ways, because conflict required competing values, and here values were singular and inherited, leaving little room for tension between desire and duty, since desire itself had been trained into narrow, manageable channels. When discomfort arose, it was interpreted not as a signal to change circumstances, but as a personal failing to be managed privately, encouraging self-regulation rather than external adjustment, and this inward focus further reduced pressure on the system to evolve. The language of responsibility reinforced this inward turn, emphasizing personal obligation over collective reflection, so individuals blamed themselves for strain while praising the institution for providing structure, a dynamic that preserved hierarchy while absorbing dissatisfaction. As generations passed, this pattern became so normalized that even suffering lost its edge, becoming routine, expected, and therefore oddly manageable, because what is anticipated is easier to endure than what is unexpected. Endurance itself became a form of identity, a quiet pride taken in withstanding limitations, and this pride reinforced restraint, discouraging expressions of frustration that might be interpreted as weakness or ingratitude. This cultural emphasis on stoicism shaped emotional expression, favoring neutrality over intensity, moderation over enthusiasm, and reserve over vulnerability, producing interactions that were polite, efficient, and emotionally distant. Distance, in turn, reduced conflict, which further justified the system's emphasis on restraint, creating a stable but emotionally sparse environment where relationships were defined more by role than by connection. Even moments of celebration adhered to this pattern, marked by formal joy rather than spontaneous happiness, with smiles measured, gestures rehearsed, and enthusiasm carefully contained to preserve decorum. As rulers aged, they often reflected not on personal fulfillment, but on whether they had maintained continuity, measuring success by the absence of disruption rather than the presence of growth, and finding reassurance in the knowledge that they had not altered the inherited pattern. This retrospective validation reinforced the belief that restraint was wisdom, encouraging successors to follow the same path, perpetuating a cycle where continuity was both goal and justification. The absence of overt crisis made this approach appear effective even as underlying issues accumulated, because slow decline lacks the urgency that prompts action, allowing problems to persist unaddressed. In this way, dynastic systems demonstrated remarkable durability, adapting just enough to survive while avoiding fundamental change, and this durability itself became evidence of legitimacy, reinforcing belief in the system's right to endure. Belief was essential because without it, the constraints would have felt unbearable, but belief transformed limitation into purpose, framing sacrifice as necessary and endurance as honorable. This framing shaped narratives passed down through generations, teaching heirs that their lives were meaningful precisely because they were constrained, that value lay in service rather than self-expression. Service, however, was defined narrowly, focused on maintaining tradition rather than responding to evolving needs, and this narrowness limited the scope of action available to those in power. As a result, rulers often felt simultaneously central and peripheral, occupying positions of authority while experiencing little agency, responsible for outcomes they could not fully influence. This paradox contributed to a sense of quiet resignation, a recognition that while the role was prestigious, it was also restrictive, offering status without freedom. Freedom, when glimpsed, appeared risky, associated with unpredictability and potential failure, making restraint feel safer by comparison. Safety became the guiding principle, shaping decisions both personal and political, favoring known risks over unknown possibilities, and reinforcing the system's conservative orientation. This orientation influenced responses to external change, leading courts to adopt new ideas cautiously, selectively, and often belatedly, ensuring that innovation never threatened core structures. Such selective adaptation allowed dynasties to appear modern while remaining fundamentally traditional, bridging eras, without truly transforming. The cost of this approach was gradual obsolescence. As institutions became increasingly symbolic, their authority derived more from history than from relevance. Yet symbolism retained power, shaping perceptions and sustaining loyalty, especially in societies that valued continuity and order. This reliance on symbolism made dynasties resilient to change but vulnerable to shifts in belief, because when belief eroded, the structure had little else to sustain it. Belief eroded slowly through accumulation of small disconnects between lived experience and institutional narrative, as people noticed discrepancies without necessarily articulating them. Within the court, these discrepancies were managed through reassurance and routine, but beyond the walls, they became harder to ignore, gradually undermining confidence. Inside the palace, however, daily life remained largely unchanged, insulated by tradition and protocol, reinforcing the sense that continuity was normal and disruption unlikely. This insulation fostered a distinct temporal experience, where time felt cyclical rather than linear, marked by repeating events rather than progression. Such cyclical time reduced urgency, making problems feel distant and manageable, because there was always another season, another ceremony, another opportunity to defer. Deferral became habit, habit became culture, and culture shaped identity, producing generations of rulers adept at maintaining balance but ill-prepared for transformation. Transformation, when it finally became unavoidable, often felt abrupt precisely because it had been postponed for so long, highlighting the limitations of endurance as a strategy. Yet within the slow unfolding of history, these moments of rupture were rare, and most lives were spent within the steady rhythm of tradition. For individuals living within this rhythm, meaning was derived not from change, but from consistency, from fulfilling expectations and maintaining order. This focus provided a sense of purpose that compensated for personal sacrifice, making constraint feel worthwhile even when it limited fulfillment. Fulfillment, reframed as duty performed well, became achievable within narrow bounds, reinforcing satisfaction through compliance rather than exploration. This psychological adjustment was crucial to the system's survival, allowing individuals to internalize constraints and find meaning within them. Over centuries, this internalization shaped collective identity, producing a culture that valued composure, restraint, and continuity above all else. Such a culture excelled at preserving form, but struggled to adapt substance, maintaining appearances while underlying realities shifted. As external pressures mounted, this imbalance became more pronounced, exposing the limits of a system designed for preservation rather than responsiveness. Yet within the palace walls, the familiar routines continued, providing comfort and reinforcing belief, even as circumstances evolved beyond their control. This persistence created a sense of inevitability, a belief that the institution would endure regardless of conditions, which discouraged proactive change. Proactivity requires imagination, and imagination was constrained by tradition, leaving little room for envisioning alternatives. Alternatives, when considered, often seemed more threatening than appealing, because they implied uncertainty and loss of control. Control, even limited, was preferable to freedom, which carried unknown risks, reinforcing the preference for stability over possibility. Thus dynastic life continued its slow course, shaped by habits formed long ago, sustained by belief, and constrained by its own success at enduring. Endurance, though admirable, gradually became its own limitation, preventing renewal and adaptation, and leaving the system increasingly fragile beneath its composed exterior. Fragility was managed rather than addressed, smoothed over through routine and reassurance, allowing decline to proceed quietly. This quiet decline lacked drama, making it difficult to recognize and easier to ignore, until it became embedded in the structure itself. Embedded decline shaped expectations, lowering ambitions and narrowing horizons, reinforcing the cycle of restraint and repetition. Yet despite these constraints, human resilience persisted, finding expression in small acts of agency, private reflections, and fleeting connections that offered glimpses of meaning beyond duty. These glimpses, though limited, sustained individuals within the system, allowing them to navigate constrained lives with dignity and composure. Dignity became the defining virtue, valued above happiness, creativity, or fulfillment, and reinforced through education, ritual, and example. This emphasis on dignity shaped behavior, encouraging individuals to accept limitation gracefully and to measure success by adherence to role rather than personal satisfaction. Such measurement reinforced the system, aligning personal identity with institutional continuity and minimizing friction. As long as this alignment held, dynasties could persist, navigating change through careful management rather than transformation. This persistence, though impressive, came at the cost of vitality, leaving institutions increasingly reliant on belief and habit rather than adaptability. Yet belief and habit proved remarkably durable, sustaining dynasties through long periods of stagnation and allowing them to survive even as relevance waned. Survival itself became the ultimate justification, reinforcing the idea that endurance was success, regardless of cost. And so the story continues, carried forward by repetition and restraint, shaped by inherited patterns and sustained by a shared commitment to continuity, as dynastic life unfolds not through dramatic change, but through the steady, quiet management of limitation, enduring far longer than it ever truly thrived. That endurance continued to define every aspect of existence inside these dynastic circles, shaping not only behavior but perception itself, so that what might have felt oppressive to an outsider felt normal, even comforting, to those raised within it. Because when limitation is all you have ever known, it does not feel like confinement, it feels like structure, and structure feels safe when uncertainty has been framed as danger for generations. Safety was the quiet currency of court life, traded constantly in small decisions, subtle compromises, and unspoken agreements, and it informed everything from how rulers spoke to their advisors to how children were corrected when they strayed too far from expectation, always gently, always with reminders of consequence rather than expressions of anger, because anger itself was unpredictable and therefore suspect. Predictability was prized above almost everything else because it reduced strain, and strain was understood intuitively as something to be avoided, not merely physically, but emotionally and politically. So even conversations followed familiar patterns, beginning and ending where they were expected to, rarely venturing into unknown territory where discomfort might arise. This predictability gave court life a strange softness, a muted quality where edges were rounded off and extremes smoothed away, leaving behind a world that felt carefully padded, designed to prevent shock or surprise, but also incapable of generating excitement or genuine engagement. Excitement was associated with risk, and risk with loss, and loss was something these families had learned to fear deeply, not always consciously but through experience, because loss had visited them often in the form of illness, infertility, and premature death, leaving behind absences that were never fully acknowledged, yet always felt. Those absences shaped behavior subtly, encouraging emotional restraint and discouraging attachment, because attachment made loss more painful, and pain was disruptive, and disruption threatened stability, so affection was moderated, grief abbreviated, and memory curated to preserve composure. This curating extended to personal narratives, with individuals learning to tell their own stories in ways that aligned with institutional values, emphasizing duty and endurance while minimizing doubt or dissatisfaction, reinforcing a shared identity built on resilience rather than reflection. Reflection itself was limited because it invited questions about purpose and meaning that could not easily be answered within the confines of inherited roles. So introspection was often redirected into acceptable channels, such as religion, routine, or meticulous attention to detail. Religion, in particular, offered a framework that validated suffering and restraint, framing them as virtues rather than burdens, and providing language that made endurance meaningful, transforming limitation into moral strength and reinforcing acceptance. Rituals associated with faith blended seamlessly with court protocol, further reinforcing structure and predictability, and offering moments of stillness that aligned with the broader emphasis on calm and control. These rituals provided comfort but also reinforced hierarchy, reminding individuals of their place within a larger order and discouraging challenges to that order by framing it as divinely sanctioned or historically inevitable. Inevitability was a powerful concept within dynastic thinking, shaping expectations and reducing resistance, because if things were meant to be this way, then struggling against them seemed futile or even inappropriate. This sense of inevitability made endurance feel less like a choice and more like a responsibility, something inherited rather than decided, and it reduced the psychological burden of constraint by framing it as destiny. Destiny, however, was passive, leaving little room for agency, and this passivity shaped rulers who were cautious rather than assertive, reactive rather than proactive, and comfortable with delegation because it diffused responsibility. Delegation further distanced rulers from direct engagement with reality, reinforcing reliance on intermediaries who filtered information and shaped perception, making governance an exercise in management rather than leadership. Management focused on maintaining balance, addressing issues just enough to prevent disruption while avoiding deep intervention that might unsettle established arrangements, ensuring continuity at the expense of progress. This approach worked well in stable conditions, allowing institutions to function smoothly without dramatic upheaval, but it struggled in the face of complex challenges that required adaptation rather than maintenance. Yet adaptation was difficult precisely because the system had been optimized for preservation, with layers of protocol and tradition that resisted change, making even small adjustments feel significant. When change did occur, it was often incremental and cautious, introduced quietly and framed as refinement rather than reform, ensuring that the core logic of the system remained intact. Such changes were absorbed slowly, becoming part of routine without altering underlying assumptions, which preserved continuity but limited impact. This pattern repeated across generations, creating a sense of slow motion within dynastic history, where events unfolded gradually and outcomes emerged over long periods rather than through decisive moments. This temporal stretching made it difficult to identify cause and effect, as actions taken decades earlier produced consequences only much later, obscuring responsibility and reinforcing the belief that decline was simply part of the natural order. Within this stretched timeline, individual lives felt brief and constrained, yet meaningful within the context of continuity, as each person contributed a small piece to a larger, enduring structure. This perspective encouraged humility but also resignation, as individuals accepted that their role was limited and their influence transient, reinforcing compliance and reducing impetus for change. Compliance was rewarded with security, status, and approval, while deviation carried social risk, encouraging conformity even among those who sensed limitations. Social reinforcement was subtle but effective, operating through praise, access, and inclusion rather than punishment, making alignment with expectations feel voluntary rather than coerced. This voluntary alignment strengthened the system, as individuals internalized its values and perpetuated them without external enforcement, creating a self-sustaining culture. Culture shaped behavior more deeply than rules ever could, influencing how people thought, felt, and responded, and ensuring continuity even as individuals changed. As a result, dynastic systems proved remarkably resilient, capable of absorbing shocks and adapting superficially without altering their core, surviving through centuries of gradual change. Yet resilience had its limits, and the very features that enabled endurance also constrained responsiveness, making it difficult to adjust when conditions shifted more rapidly. This tension between resilience and adaptability lay at the heart of dynastic decline, though it was rarely recognized as such by those living within the system. Instead, decline was experienced as fatigue, as a sense of effort required to maintain appearances, as an increasing reliance on routine to manage complexity, all of which felt manageable individually but collectively signaled strain. Strain manifested subtly through cautious decision-making, reduced ambition, and an emphasis on avoiding mistakes rather than pursuing opportunities, reinforcing stagnation. Stagnation, however, was not immediately visible, masked by ceremony and continuity, and so it persisted, gradually eroding relevance without provoking crisis. Within the palace, life continued with familiar rhythms, providing comfort and reinforcing belief, while outside conditions evolved, creating a widening disconnect. This disconnect was felt unevenly, more acutely by those who ventured beyond the court's insulated environment, and less so by those whose lives remained contained within it. Those who sensed the gap often lacked the authority or support to address it, and so their concerns remained private, contributing to isolation rather than reform. Isolation reinforced inward focus, encouraging further withdrawal from external realities and deepening reliance on tradition as a source of meaning and legitimacy. Tradition became both anchor and blindfold, grounding identity while obscuring change and sustaining belief even as circumstances shifted. Belief, in turn, sustained the system, making continuity feel natural and inevitable, and discouraging questioning that might destabilize established patterns. As long as belief held, dynasties could endure, navigating change through careful management rather than transformation, and preserving form even as substance evolved. Yet belief was not static, and over time it required reinforcement through ritual, narrative, and symbolism, increasing the system's dependence on performance. Performance demanded energy, coordination, and consistency, and as vitality waned, maintaining performance became more challenging, requiring greater effort for diminishing returns. This increasing effort further exhausted individuals and institutions, reinforcing caution and discouraging risk, as resources were focused on sustaining appearances rather than investing in renewal. Renewal, when attempted, often came too late or in forms constrained by tradition, limiting its effectiveness and reinforcing skepticism about change. Skepticism became a default stance, shaping attitudes toward innovation and reinforcing preference for proven methods, even when those methods were no longer effective. Effectiveness was measured narrowly, focused on short-term stability rather than long-term resilience, reinforcing choices that postponed rather than resolved challenges. This postponement extended the lifespan of dynastic systems but also accumulated unresolved issues, creating conditions for eventual rupture. Yet rupture remained distant and abstract for most individuals, whose daily lives were shaped more by routine than by awareness of systemic fragility. For them, meaning lay in fulfilling expectations, maintaining dignity, and contributing to continuity, values reinforced through education, ritual, and example. These values provided structure and purpose, compensating for limitations and making endurance feel worthwhile, even as vitality diminished. Thus, dynastic life persisted in a delicate balance, sustained by belief, habit, and careful management, enduring through long periods of quiet decline without dramatic collapse. The absence of collapse reinforced confidence, making it difficult to imagine an end to a system that had endured for so long and further discouraging proactive change. As time passed, this confidence became complacency, a quiet assumption that continuity itself guaranteed survival, overlooking the need for adaptation. Adaptation, when finally required, often faced resistance from habits and beliefs formed in quieter times, limiting the system's capacity to respond effectively. Yet even in the face of mounting challenges, life within the palace continued much as it always had, marked by routine, ceremony, and careful restraint. This continuity provided comfort and stability to those within, even as it contributed to growing irrelevance beyond the walls. Irrelevance, however, was slow to register because the system's internal measures of success remained unchanged, focused on endurance rather than impact. As long as the crown passed on, ceremonies continued, and order was maintained, the institution considered itself successful, regardless of broader shifts. This narrow definition of success sustained dynasties for centuries, allowing them to persist through adaptation and decline, but it also ensured that when change finally became unavoidable, it would feel sudden and overwhelming. Still, within the long arc of history, most lives were spent not in moments of upheaval, but in the steady rhythm of tradition, where endurance was routine and continuity unquestioned. For those living within this rhythm, meaning was found not in transformation, but in maintenance, not in growth, but in stability, and this meaning sustained them through constrained lives. A quiet acceptance of constraint settled so deeply into daily life that it shaped even the smallest gestures, the way hands were folded, the way eyes lowered at precisely the right moment, the way pauses were allowed to linger just long enough to feel thoughtful, but never long enough to feel uncertain, because uncertainty suggested weakness, and weakness was something dynastic culture worked tirelessly to smooth over, soften, and eventually erase from view. Children absorbed this atmosphere without being taught explicitly, learning through observation rather than instruction, watching how adults navigated rooms, how conversations curved gently around sensitive topics, how silence was often more valuable than speech, and by the time they were old enough to ask questions, they already understood which questions were welcome and which were better left unformed. This produced a peculiar maturity at a very young age, not the energetic curiosity of discovery, but a reserved awareness of boundaries, a sense of caution that made children appear composed beyond their years, praised for their good sense while quietly missing out on the freedom that good sense replaced. Freedom was never framed as something desirable in its own right, but rather as something that had to be earned through discipline, though in practice it was rarely granted even then, because discipline itself became the goal, proof of suitability rather than a means to an end. Suitability mattered immensely, because dynastic systems depended not on brilliance but on reliability, not on originality but on consistency, and those who fit smoothly into this framework were valued above those who challenged it, regardless of talent. Talent, when present, was carefully directed into acceptable channels, refined into skill rather than allowed to expand into innovation, ensuring that individual strengths reinforced rather than disrupted the existing order. Music was practiced, not composed. Art was mastered, not reimagined. Scholarship was respected, but only insofar as it supported established narratives and traditions. Even intellect, which might seem inherently disruptive, was managed through emphasis on classical knowledge and historical precedent, encouraging reverence for the past rather than exploration of new ideas. This reverence created a shared cultural memory that bound generations together, offering a sense of continuity that was emotionally grounding even as it limited growth. Memory became selective, focusing on triumphs and endurance while quietly minimizing conflict, failure, or doubt, shaping identity through curated history rather than lived complexity. This curation extended to personal memory as well, with individuals encouraged to frame their own experiences in ways that aligned with collective narratives, smoothing over moments of dissatisfaction or regret. Regret itself was discouraged, seen as unproductive and potentially destabilizing, because it implied that things could have been otherwise, a notion incompatible with the emphasis on inevitability. So lives were lived forward without looking back too closely, each stage accepted as necessary and appropriate, even when it felt constricting or unfulfilling. Marriage marked one such stage, approached with seriousness rather than anticipation, understood as duty rather than partnership, and entered into with careful preparation rather than romantic expectation. Affection, if it developed, was welcomed quietly but never assumed, and many couples settled into polite coexistence, managing households and appearances together while maintaining emotional distance. This distance was not necessarily hostile, but rather functional, reducing friction and preserving harmony, though at the cost of intimacy. Children born into these unions inherited not only status but emotional restraint, growing up surrounded by adults who modeled composure rather than vulnerability, shaping their own expectations accordingly. Vulnerability was associated with instability, and instability was feared, so even moments of illness or loss were handled with measured calm, emotions acknowledged briefly before being redirected into acceptable forms of expression. Funerals were solemn and dignified, grief expressed through ritual rather than display, reinforcing the idea that personal feeling should never overshadow public responsibility. Responsibility loomed over every role, framing life as a series of obligations to be fulfilled rather than experiences to be enjoyed. And while this provided clarity, it also narrowed the range of acceptable emotion. Joy, when it appeared, was understated, a quiet satisfaction rather than exuberance, praised precisely because it did not disrupt order. Laughter existed, but it was controlled, polite, and brief, never allowed to spill into chaos or irreverence. This emotional moderation extended to ambition, which was tempered by caution and guided by tradition, ensuring that aspirations aligned with institutional needs rather than personal desire. Desire itself was treated carefully, acknowledged only when it could be integrated into existing structures and otherwise redirected or suppressed. Suppression over time became habitual, shaping inner lives that were orderly but constrained, rich in routine but sparse in spontaneity. Spontaneity was viewed with suspicion, associated with impulsiveness and risk, qualities incompatible with dynastic survival. Risk aversion shaped policy as well as personal behavior, encouraging incremental change and discouraging bold action, even when circumstances might have benefited from decisiveness. Decisiveness, when displayed, was often ceremonial rather than substantive, reinforcing authority through symbolism rather than effect. Symbols carried great weight, providing continuity and legitimacy, and were carefully maintained through pageantry, architecture, and tradition. Architecture itself reflected these values, with spaces designed to impress rather than comfort, to convey stability rather than adaptability, reinforcing hierarchy through scale and form. Rooms were arranged to guide movement and behavior, subtly directing interactions and reinforcing roles, ensuring that individuals moved through space as they were expected to move through life. Private spaces were limited, reinforcing constant awareness of observation and encouraging self-regulation even when alone. This constant self-regulation became second nature, shaping thought patterns and emotional responses, and making deviation feel uncomfortable even in private. Comfort was found not in freedom but in familiarity, in routines repeated daily, weekly, annually, creating a sense of predictability that offset constraint. Calendars were filled with obligations that structured time, leaving little room for unstructured reflection, and reinforcing the feeling that life was always in motion, even when nothing truly changed. Change, when it occurred, was often external, imposed by circumstance rather than initiated from within, and thus experienced as disruption rather than opportunity. Disruption was managed through adaptation rather than transformation, adjusting practices just enough to restore balance without challenging underlying assumptions. These adjustments accumulated slowly, allowing dynastic systems to persist through shifting contexts while maintaining core identity. Identity was defined less by individual characteristics than by role, lineage, and continuity, making personal distinction less important than collective representation. Representation required consistency, reinforcing conformity and discouraging deviation, even when deviation might have improved effectiveness. Effectiveness was secondary to legitimacy, and legitimacy derived from tradition, making preservation the primary objective. Preservation justified decisions that prioritized appearance over substance, ensuring that continuity was visible even if vitality waned. This emphasis on visibility reinforced reliance on ritual, ceremony, and performance, increasing the system's dependence on external affirmation. Affirmation came through recognition by peers and subjects, reinforcing authority and validating endurance. Yet affirmation was conditional, requiring ongoing performance, creating pressure to maintain standards that grew increasingly difficult to meet. Difficulty was rarely acknowledged openly, instead absorbed quietly through increased effort, reinforcing fatigue and discouraging risk. Fatigue became a background condition, normalized through routine and accepted as part of duty, even as it reduced capacity for innovation. Innovation, when attempted, often faced resistance from tradition and skepticism, limiting its scope and impact. This cycle of cautious adaptation and preservation sustained dynastic systems while gradually reducing their responsiveness. Responsiveness required flexibility, but flexibility conflicted with the emphasis on stability, creating tension that was resolved in favor of continuity. Continuity provided reassurance, anchoring identity and offering meaning, even as it constrained growth. Meaning derived from participation in a long-standing narrative, connecting individual lives to a larger story that extended beyond them. This narrative emphasized endurance, resilience, and duty, framing constraint as virtue and stability as success. Within this framework, dissatisfaction was reframed as restlessness, something to be managed rather than explored. Exploration, whether intellectual or emotional, was limited, encouraging depth within narrow boundaries rather than breadth across possibilities. Depth was found in mastery of routine, refinement of skill, and attention to detail, qualities that reinforced excellence within constraint. Excellence became defined as flawless execution rather than creative expression, reinforcing the system's values. Over time, these values produced individuals who were highly competent within their roles, but less equipped to navigate change beyond them. This mismatch became more pronounced as external conditions evolved, increasing the gap between institutional culture and broader reality. The gap was managed through insulation, limiting exposure to external influence and reinforcing internal cohesion. Insulation provided protection but also isolation, reducing awareness of shifting contexts and delaying adaptation. Delayed adaptation increased vulnerability, even as the system appeared stable, creating a false sense of security. Security was reinforced through ritual affirmation, masking underlying fragility and sustaining confidence. Confidence, once established, discouraged questioning, reinforcing complacency and reducing preparedness for change. Preparedness required imagination, but imagination was constrained by tradition, limiting foresight. Foresight, when exercised, often focused on preserving existing arrangements rather than envisioning alternatives. Alternatives were perceived as threats, reinforcing resistance to change even when conditions demanded it. This resistance was rarely explicit, manifesting instead as hesitation, delay, and preference for familiar solutions. These preferences shaped decisions across generations, reinforcing patterns that sustained the system while gradually reducing its adaptability. Adaptability declined not through sudden failure, but through accumulated rigidity, a slow stiffening that limited movement. Movement became more symbolic than substantive, reinforcing appearance over function. Functionality was maintained just enough to preserve order, but not enough to enable growth. Growth, when it occurred, was external, driven by broader forces rather than internal initiative. This reliance on external change further reduced agency, reinforcing passivity and acceptance. Acceptance became the dominant mode of engagement, shaping attitudes toward both success and failure. Success was measured by continuity, failure by disruption, reinforcing caution. Caution sustained stability but limited opportunity, creating a paradox at the heart of dynastic endurance. This paradox allowed systems to persist long after their vitality waned, sustained by habit, belief, and careful management. That persistence of tradition shaped even the smallest rhythms of daily existence, turning repetition into reassurance and familiarity into a form of comfort that dulled awareness of constraint. Because when the same patterns repeat endlessly, they stop feeling imposed and start feeling natural. And what feels natural rarely invites challenge or scrutiny, especially when it has been framed since birth as the proper order of things. Meals followed predictable sequences, not merely in timing, but in tone, conversation drifting through safe territories that avoided controversy or depth, touching lightly on matters of etiquette, ceremony, and shared memory, reinforcing cohesion without inviting reflection, because reflection might uncover dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction had no place at the table. Servants moved with practiced precision, their presence both constant and invisible, reinforcing hierarchy without needing to assert it, and this seamless coordination further normalized the structure of power, making authority feel ambient rather than imposed. Authority itself was rarely questioned within these spaces, because it was not experienced as a personal force, but as an inherited condition, like architecture or weather, shaping life without requiring explanation. This ambient authority shaped expectations subtly, influencing how individuals assessed themselves and others, valuing composure, restraint, and adherence to protocol above spontaneity or innovation. Protocol provided clarity, eliminating ambiguity by prescribing behavior for nearly every situation, reducing anxiety by removing the need for personal judgment, and in doing so, it replaced choice with certainty. Certainty was comforting, especially in environments where unpredictability was associated with danger, and so individuals embraced protocol not merely out of obligation, but out of preference. Preference reinforced habit, habit reinforced identity, and identity reinforced continuity, creating a feedback loop that sustained the system with remarkable efficiency. Within this loop, individuality was expressed through nuance rather than divergence, through subtle variations in demeanor rather than overt difference, allowing personal distinction without threatening cohesion. These nuances were carefully observed and interpreted, forming the basis of reputation and influence, because in a system where overt action was limited, perception mattered greatly. Perception was managed through consistency, reliability, and measured expression, ensuring that individuals were seen as dependable and aligned with institutional values. Dependability was rewarded with trust, access, and subtle authority, reinforcing conformity as the path to influence. Influence itself was exercised quietly, through suggestion rather than command, shaping outcomes without drawing attention and reinforcing the system's preference for subtlety over force. Force was associated with instability, and so even decisive actions were framed gently, implemented gradually, and justified through precedent rather than necessity. Precedent provided legitimacy, anchoring decisions in history and reducing resistance by framing change as continuation rather than departure. This reliance on precedent shaped governance into an exercise in interpretation rather than innovation, where success depended on aligning present needs with past examples. Interpretation required scholarship and memory, elevating those who mastered historical knowledge and reinforcing reverence for tradition. Tradition became both guide and constraint, shaping not only policy but imagination, limiting the range of conceivable futures to variations of the past. This limited imagination fostered stability but constrained growth, ensuring that adaptation occurred within narrow bounds. Bounds were reinforced through education, which emphasized classical learning, moral instruction, and reverence for lineage, shaping minds to value continuity over curiosity. Curiosity, when it appeared, was redirected into acceptable pursuits, such as collecting artifacts, cataloging knowledge, or studying genealogy, activities that reinforced rather than challenged existing frameworks. Genealogy itself was a central focus, providing a tangible connection to the past and reinforcing identity through lineage rather than achievement. Lineage offered legitimacy, grounding authority in ancestry rather than merit, and reducing the need for personal accomplishment. Accomplishment was still valued, but primarily as confirmation of suitability rather than evidence of innovation. Suitability remained the primary criterion for advancement, ensuring that those who rose within the system did so because they fit its expectations. Fitting in required emotional regulation, intellectual conformity, and behavioral consistency, qualities cultivated from an early age. Early cultivation shaped children into adults who navigated life with caution and composure, adept at managing appearances but less comfortable with uncertainty. Uncertainty was avoided whenever possible, managed through planning, ritual, and consultation, reinforcing reliance on established processes. Consultation diffused responsibility, reducing individual risk, and reinforcing collective decision-making, though often at the cost of decisiveness. Decisiveness, when necessary, was cloaked in ceremony, transforming choice into obligation and reducing perceived agency. Agency was further diluted by the emphasis on destiny and duty, framing life as a series of roles to be fulfilled rather than paths to be chosen. Choice, when it existed, was constrained, offering options within narrow boundaries rather than genuine alternatives. These constrained choices reinforced acceptance, making compliance feel voluntary even when options were limited. Voluntary compliance strengthened the system, reducing the need for coercion and reinforcing internalization of norms. Internalization shaped conscience, aligning personal values with institutional expectations and reducing internal conflict. Conflict, when it arose, was managed quietly, through mediation and compromise rather than confrontation, preserving harmony at the expense of resolution. Resolution was less important than stability, and so issues were often deferred rather than addressed, accumulating beneath the surface. Accumulation created latent tension, but tension was normalized, absorbed into routine, and rarely acknowledged openly. Acknowledgement might invite change, and change was disruptive, so silence became a strategy for preservation. Silence shaped communication, encouraging indirect expression and subtle signaling rather than direct speech. These indirect forms required careful interpretation, fostering attentiveness and restraint, and reinforcing the value of nuance. Nuance allowed disagreement without disruption, providing a way to navigate differences while maintaining cohesion. Cohesion was paramount because fragmentation threatened continuity, and continuity was the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was not progress but persistence, not improvement but survival, measured not in achievement but in duration. Duration itself became a metric of success, reinforcing pride in endurance and resilience. Resilience was celebrated through narratives of hardship overcome, often framed as tests of character rather than systemic challenges. These narratives reinforced belief in the system's inherent strength, discouraging examination of its limitations. Limitations were reframed as features, constraints as virtues, and rigidity as reliability. Reliability fostered trust, both internally and externally, reinforcing legitimacy and authority. Legitimacy reduced the need for force, allowing power to operate through acceptance rather than enforcement. Acceptance was cultivated through ceremony, education, and narrative, embedding authority within culture. Culture became the primary mechanism of control, shaping behavior through shared values rather than explicit rules. Rules still existed, but they were reinforced by custom and expectation, making compliance intuitive. Intuition replaced deliberation, allowing individuals to act appropriately without conscious effort. This ease of action reduced friction and preserved calm, reinforcing the system's preference for smooth operation. Smooth operation masked inefficiencies, allowing problems to persist unnoticed or unaddressed. Addressing problems required disruption, and disruption was avoided, so inefficiencies accumulated slowly. Slow accumulation delayed crisis, extending the system's lifespan while increasing eventual vulnerability. Vulnerability was managed through insulation, limiting exposure to external pressures and reinforcing internal cohesion. Cohesion provided strength but also fostered groupthink, limiting diversity of perspective. Perspective was shaped by shared experience, reinforcing consensus but reducing adaptability. Adaptability required openness, but openness conflicted with the emphasis on stability and control. Control was maintained through ritual and routine, reinforcing predictability and reducing anxiety. Anxiety was managed through structure, offering reassurance in the face of uncertainty. This reassurance sustained individuals through constrained lives, providing meaning and purpose. Purpose was defined by role and duty, offering clarity but limiting self-determination. Self-determination was less valued than reliability, reinforcing conformity. Conformity sustained order, order sustained legitimacy, and legitimacy sustained power. Power operated quietly, embedded in tradition, and accepted as natural. Naturalization of power reduced resistance, making authority feel inevitable. Inevitability discouraged challenge, reinforcing passivity. Passivity became a virtue, praised as patience and restraint. Restraint shaped emotional expression, reinforcing composure and dignity. Dignity was prized, serving as a visible marker of suitability and status. Status was inherited rather than earned, reinforcing hierarchy. Hierarchy provided clarity, structuring relationships and expectations. Expectations guided behavior, reducing ambiguity and conflict. Conflict, when unavoidable, was managed through ritualized processes, preserving order. Order was the system's defining value, shaping every aspect of life. Life within this order unfolded slowly, marked by repetition and restraint. Repetition reinforced familiarity, familiarity reinforced comfort. Comfort reduced desire for change, sustaining continuity. Continuity extended the system's lifespan, allowing it to persist across generations. Generations passed quietly, each inheriting the same structures and expectations. Inheritance shaped identity, connecting individuals to a lineage rather than a future. The future was imagined as continuation rather than transformation. Transformation was feared, associated with instability and loss. Loss had been experienced deeply, reinforcing caution. Caution guided decisions, reinforcing incrementalism. Incrementalism sustained stability but limited responsiveness. Responsiveness declined gradually, unnoticed, until challenged. Challenges were often external, imposed rather than anticipated. Anticipation required imagination, which was constrained by tradition. Tradition shaped thought, limiting the range of conceivable outcomes. Outcomes were managed rather than pursued, reinforcing passivity. Passivity sustained endurance, but reduced vitality. Vitality waned slowly, masked by ceremony and ritual. Ritual reinforced belief, sustaining confidence. Confidence discouraged questioning, reinforcing complacency. Complacency delayed adaptation, increasing vulnerability. Vulnerability remained hidden beneath appearances. Appearances were maintained meticulously, reinforcing legitimacy. Legitimacy sustained authority, allowing the system to persist. Persistence became the defining feature, overshadowing all else. That endurance carried forward quietly into the intimate details of daily perception, shaping not just actions, but the internal landscape of thought itself, where expectations were arranged neatly like furniture that had never been moved, familiar enough to navigate in the dark, comforting precisely because they had no sharp corners left to surprise anyone who brushed against them. Thoughts followed well-worn paths, looping gently around familiar concerns, returning again and again to duty, propriety, and balance, rarely wandering into speculative territory where questions might arise about alternatives or possibilities, because possibilities implied choice, and choice implied responsibility, and responsibility was already heavy enough without adding unnecessary weight. This mental economy favored conservation over exploration, preserving emotional energy by limiting the range of acceptable contemplation, and in doing so, it created a calm surface that concealed the complexity beneath, a surface that was admired and emulated because it appeared effortless. Effortlessness became an aesthetic ideal, signaling mastery and control, and those who achieved it were praised not for what they did, but for how little it appeared to cost them, reinforcing the belief that true suitability lay in seamless performance rather than visible struggle. Struggle was acknowledged only in abstract terms, framed as something overcome long ago or endured collectively rather than experienced personally, keeping discomfort at a safe distance where it could be respected without being felt. Feeling deeply was not discouraged outright, but it was expected to be managed, contained within appropriate contexts, and expressed in measured ways that preserved dignity and order. Order governed everything, from the arrangement of rooms to the cadence of speech, from the progression of ceremonies to the rhythms of daily routine, creating an environment where predictability was both shield and guide. Guidance came not from explicit instruction, but from immersion, as individuals absorbed norms through repetition and example, learning what was acceptable by observing what was rewarded. Rewards were subtle, often intangible, taking the form of approval, inclusion, or quiet recognition, reinforcing desired behaviors without drawing attention to the mechanisms behind them. These mechanisms operated quietly, shaping outcomes without overt force, making compliance feel natural and resistance unnecessary. Resistance, when it appeared, was often internal rather than external, experienced as restlessness or dissatisfaction rather than rebellion, and it was usually managed through redirection rather than confrontation. Redirection took many forms, encouraging focus on acceptable pursuits, reinforcing routines, or emphasizing the virtues of patience and restraint, ensuring that energy remained contained. Containment was a recurring theme, applied not only to emotion, but to ambition, curiosity, and even imagination, getting all toward stability. Stability was treated as the ultimate achievement, the proof of success, and it was celebrated through continuity rather than innovation. Innovation was tolerated only when it could be framed as refinement, improving efficiency or elegance without altering underlying structures. Structures remained largely unchanged, providing a consistent framework within which lives unfolded predictably. Predictability reduced anxiety, offering reassurance in a world perceived as fragile and uncertain beyond the walls of tradition. These walls were not always physical, but conceptual, formed by shared beliefs and expectations that define the boundaries of acceptable thought and behavior. Within these boundaries, life was orderly and calm, if somewhat constrained, offering security at the expense of freedom. Freedom was rarely discussed as an abstract concept, understood instead as the ability to fulfill one's role without disruption, a definition that aligned neatly with institutional values. This alignment ensured cohesion, minimizing friction and preserving harmony, even as it limited individual expression. Expression found outlets in subtle variation, in tone, timing, and nuance, allowing for personal distinction without challenging the collective. Collective identity was paramount, reinforced through shared rituals and narratives that connected individuals to a lineage rather than a personal story. Personal stories were woven into the larger tapestry, their edges softened to blend seamlessly with tradition. This blending reduced the sharpness of individual experience, smoothing highs and lows into a steady rhythm that felt manageable. Manageability was prized because it made life predictable and therefore controllable, reinforcing confidence in the system. Confidence, in turn, discouraged questioning, sustaining belief even as conditions shifted gradually. Shifts were often too slow to register clearly, perceived as minor adjustments rather than fundamental changes, allowing complacency to persist. Complacency was not laziness, but trust, a trust in the endurance of tradition and the adequacy of established methods. This trust was reinforced by history, by the long record of survival through past challenges, which became proof of inherent strength. Strength was defined not by adaptability, but by resilience, by the ability to withstand pressure without altering form. Form mattered deeply, symbolizing continuity and legitimacy, and so preserving form became a central concern. Preservation extended to language, gesture, and appearance, maintaining a consistent aesthetic that reinforced identity. Identity was inseparable from lineage, connecting individuals to ancestors whose experiences were idealized and simplified. Simplification made history comforting, turning complexity into narrative clarity and reinforcing belief in continuity. Continuity offered meaning, anchoring lives within a larger story that extended beyond individual existence. This extension reduced the fear of insignificance, providing purpose through participation rather than achievement. Achievement was still valued, but only insofar as it supported the collective narrative, reinforcing rather than redefining identity. Redefinition was rare and often resisted, seen as destabilizing and unnecessary. Necessity was a powerful filter, justifying change only when survival was clearly at stake. This high threshold delayed adaptation, allowing challenges to grow gradually until they demanded attention. Even then, responses were cautious, incremental, and framed as restoration rather than transformation. Transformation implied risk, and risk was avoided whenever possible, reinforcing conservatism. Conservatism shaped policy and personal behavior alike, encouraging moderation and discouraging extremes. Extremes were associated with chaos, a concept deeply feared within dynastic culture. Chaos threatened order, and order was synonymous with legitimacy and security. Security justified constraint, making limitations feel protective rather than oppressive. Protection became a moral good, reinforcing acceptance of boundaries. Boundaries defined roles clearly, reducing ambiguity and conflict. Conflict was managed through protocol and mediation, preserving surface harmony even when underlying tensions persisted. Persistence of tension was normalized, absorbed into routine, and rarely addressed directly. Directness was avoided, replaced by implication and suggestion, requiring attentiveness and subtlety. Subtlety became a valued skill, allowing individuals to navigate complexity without overt disruption. Navigation relied on intuition shaped by experience, reinforcing conformity. Conformity sustained cohesion, which sustained stability. Stability reinforced legitimacy, and legitimacy sustained power. Power was diffuse, embedded in structures rather than concentrated in individuals. This diffusion reduced personal accountability, making outcomes feel collective and inevitable. Inevitability discouraged resistance, reinforcing passivity. Passivity was reframed as patience, a virtue praised and cultivated. Patience aligned with the long timelines of dynastic thinking, where change unfolded slowly. Slow change reduced shock, allowing systems to absorb pressure gradually. Gradualism extended lifespan but limited responsiveness. Responsiveness required flexibility, which conflicted with rigidity. Rigidity provided reassurance, maintaining form even as substance shifted. Substance eroded quietly, masked by ritual and appearance. Appearance was meticulously maintained, reinforcing confidence. Confidence delayed recognition of decline. Decline was experienced as fatigue rather than failure, a subtle weariness that accumulated over time. Weariness was normalized, accepted as the cost of endurance. Endurance was celebrated, becoming the defining virtue. This celebration sustained morale, reinforcing belief. Belief anchored identity, sustaining the system. The system persisted through habit and acceptance. Acceptance reduced friction, smoothing daily life. Daily life unfolded predictably, reinforcing familiarity. Familiarity provided comfort. Comfort reduced desire for change. Change was perceived as disruption. Disruption was avoided. Avoidance sustained continuity. Continuity reinforced tradition. Tradition shaped thought. Thought reinforced behavior. Behavior sustained structure. Structure preserved power. Power endured quietly. That sense of timelessness settled into the bones of the institution, creating an atmosphere where days blended into one another so seamlessly that the passage of time felt less like movement and more like gentle layering, each day resting softly atop the last, adding weight but never momentum, until years passed almost unnoticed, marked only by subtle shifts in faces, voices, and responsibilities rather than by any dramatic turning point. In this environment, memory functioned differently, less as a sequence of events and more as a texture, a continuous backdrop of familiar sensations, sounds, and expectations that defined reality itself, making it difficult to distinguish where one phase of life ended and another began, because transitions were deliberately smoothed to prevent disruption. Coming of age was not a sharp threshold, but a gradual assumption of duties. Responsibilities added one by one, like additional garments layered carefully to maintain balance and composure, ensuring that the wearer never felt suddenly burdened, even as the weight increased steadily over time. These added responsibilities rarely came with new freedoms, instead reinforcing existing constraints, but because they were introduced incrementally, they were accepted without protest, perceived as natural extensions of what had always been expected. Expectation shaped identity more strongly than desire, guiding individuals toward roles that felt inevitable rather than chosen. And because inevitability was framed as destiny, it carried a sense of dignity that softened the loss of agency. Dignity mattered greatly, serving as a buffer against dissatisfaction and providing a framework within which limitation could be interpreted as virtue rather than deprivation. Virtue was defined narrowly, emphasizing patience, restraint, loyalty, and composure, qualities that supported continuity and discouraged disruption. These virtues were celebrated openly, reinforced through praise and example, while qualities associated with change or challenge was subtly devalued, framed as impractical or immature. Immaturity was equated with unpredictability, and unpredictability was feared, so emotional expression was carefully moderated, allowing only those feelings that could be integrated smoothly into the existing order. Anger, grief, and joy were all permitted, but only in measured forms, expressed through ritual rather than spontaneity, ensuring that emotion reinforced rather than destabilized structure. Structure provided a sense of safety, especially in a world perceived as inherently uncertain beyond the boundaries of tradition, and this perception justified the careful preservation of established forms. Preservation extended to language itself, with formalized modes of address and expression reinforcing hierarchy and reducing ambiguity, ensuring that communication remained predictable and controlled. Predictability reduced conflict, making interactions smoother and more manageable, but it also limited authenticity, encouraging performance over sincerity. Performance became second nature, internalized so deeply that individuals no longer distinguished between role and self, experiencing identity as function rather than expression. This functional identity reduced internal conflict, aligning personal values with institutional expectations, but it also limited self-awareness, discouraging introspection that might reveal dissatisfaction. Introspection was not entirely absent, but it was often guided toward acceptable themes, such as duty, faith, or lineage, rather than personal desire or alternative futures. Alternative futures were difficult to imagine within a system that emphasized continuity above all else, and imagination itself was subtly constrained by education and culture. Education focused on mastery of established knowledge rather than exploration, reinforcing respect for tradition and authority while limiting exposure to novel ideas. Novelty was treated cautiously, embraced only when it could be assimilated without altering core structures, ensuring that innovation served preservation rather than transformation. Transformation was associated with instability, a concept deeply unsettling to a culture that valued balance and control. Control was maintained through routine, ritual, and hierarchy, creating an environment where deviation felt uncomfortable even when unobserved. This internalized control reduced the need for external enforcement, making compliance feel voluntary and natural. Naturalization of authority was one of the system's greatest strengths, embedding power within culture rather than imposing it through force. Force was reserved for exceptional circumstances, and its rarity reinforced the perception of legitimacy, making authority feel benevolent rather than coercive. Benevolence was emphasized in narrative and symbolism, portraying leadership as stewardship rather than dominance, further encouraging acceptance. Acceptance was cultivated from an early age, shaping expectations and reducing resistance before it could form. Resistance, when it did appear, was often subtle, expressed through withdrawal or quiet dissatisfaction rather than open challenge. Such dissatisfaction was rarely articulated, lacking both language and audience, and so it dissipated quietly, absorbed into routine. Routine acted as a soothing mechanism, offering predictability and structure that compensated for emotional constraint. Constraint was reframed as discipline, and discipline as strength, reinforcing positive associations with limitation. This reframing shaped self-perception, encouraging pride in endurance and composure rather than regret over missed possibilities. Possibilities were not emphasized, because emphasizing them would invite comparison, and comparison might breed discontent. Contentment was cultivated through gratitude for stability and status, reinforcing loyalty and compliance. Loyalty was a central value, binding individuals to institution and lineage, and discouraging actions that might undermine continuity. Continuity was both goal and justification, guiding decisions across generations and shaping responses to challenge. Challenges were interpreted through the lens of history, framed as repetitions of past difficulties rather than unprecedented threats. This historical framing reduced urgency, encouraging measured responses rather than rapid adaptation. Measured responses prioritized caution, preserving form even as conditions evolved. Evolution occurred slowly, often unnoticed, as adjustments were layered quietly atop existing structures. These layers added complexity but not flexibility, reinforcing rigidity beneath apparent change. Rigidity provided reassurance, maintaining familiar forms and reducing anxiety. Anxiety was managed through control, routine, and belief, creating an atmosphere of calm that masked underlying tension. Tension accumulated gradually as unresolved issues persisted beneath the surface, managed but never resolved. Resolution was less important than stability, and so compromise and postponement became standard strategies. These strategies extended the lifespan of the system while increasing its fragility, a paradox inherent in dynastic endurance. Fragility remained hidden as long as appearances were maintained, and appearances were maintained meticulously. Meticulous attention to detail ensured consistency, reinforcing legitimacy and confidence. Confidence discouraged questioning, reinforcing complacency and delaying adaptation. Adaptation, when forced, was constrained by tradition, limiting effectiveness. Effectiveness was secondary to legitimacy, and so even ineffective practices persisted if they reinforced continuity. This prioritization shaped governance, culture, and personal behavior alike, reinforcing a system optimized for endurance rather than innovation. Endurance was celebrated through ritual and narrative, reinforcing belief in the system's inherent strength. Belief sustained morale, providing meaning and purpose within constrained lives. Purpose was defined collectively, reducing emphasis on individual fulfillment. Fulfillment was found in service and continuity, rather than self-expression or achievement. Achievement was valued only when it reinforced the collective narrative, ensuring alignment with institutional values. Alignment reduced conflict, sustaining harmony and cohesion. Cohesion strengthened the system, making it resilient to internal disruption. Resilience allowed survival through gradual change, reinforcing confidence. Confidence became complacency, reducing preparedness for rapid shifts. Rapid shifts were rare within the system's internal experience, making them difficult to anticipate. Anticipation required imagination, which was constrained by tradition. Tradition shaped thought, limiting the range of conceivable responses. Responses were guided by precedent, reinforcing continuity. Continuity delayed recognition of decline, allowing erosion to proceed quietly. Erosion was experienced as fatigue, a gradual weariness that became normalized. Normalization reduced urgency, making decline feel manageable. Manageability sustained acceptance, reinforcing passivity. Passivity was reframed as patience and wisdom, virtues celebrated and rewarded. Reward reinforced behavior, sustaining the cycle. The cycle repeated across generations, each inheriting the same structures, values, and expectations. Inheritance shaped identity, connecting individuals to a lineage rather than a future. The future was imagined as extension of the past, reinforcing continuity. Transformation was feared, associated with loss of control. Control was maintained through ritual, routine, and belief. Belief anchored identity, sustaining legitimacy. Legitimacy sustained authority, allowing power to persist quietly. Quiet persistence defined the rhythm of dynastic life, unfolding slowly through repetition and restraint. Life moved in gentle cycles, marked by routine rather than rupture. Rupture was avoided, postponed, or absorbed into tradition. Absorption reduced shock, preserving calm. Calm reinforced confidence, sustaining belief. Belief sustained endurance. Endurance became the ultimate measure of success. Success was defined by survival, not progress. Progress was secondary to stability. Stability provided comfort, reinforcing acceptance. Acceptance sustained continuity. Continuity preserved tradition. Tradition shaped culture. Culture shaped behavior. Behavior sustained structure. Structure preserved power. Power endured quietly. That steadfast sameness eventually settled into a kind of quiet stillness, where motion existed but momentum did not, and life continued forward almost by inertia alone, carried by the accumulated weight of habit rather than by intention, as if the system itself had learned how to move without thinking, repeating familiar gestures, because stopping to reconsider them would require an effort no one felt prepared to make. In this stillness, time lost its sharp edges, smoothing into a continuous present where past and future blurred together, and individuals experienced their lives less as journeys and more as occupations, something to be maintained rather than explored, performed rather than questioned, accepted rather than reshaped. Acceptance became the final inheritance, passed down as reliably as titles or names, embedded so deeply that it felt like wisdom rather than resignation, teaching each generation that endurance was not merely necessary but noble, that persistence itself was proof of worth. And so the system endured, not because it was vibrant or responsive, but because it was familiar, because it asked little imagination and offered steady reassurance, because it rewarded conformity with comfort and punished deviation with uncertainty, and uncertainty had always been the greater fear. Within its walls, lives unfolded quietly, marked by routine ceremonies, predictable duties, and carefully managed emotions, each person contributing their small, precise part to the larger mechanism, rarely seeing the whole, but trusting that the whole would continue as it always had. Trust replaced curiosity, duty replaced desire, and continuity replaced ambition, creating a world where change felt unnecessary simply because survival had never required it before. And in that belief, deeply rooted and rarely challenged, the dynastic rhythm carried on, steady and unhurried, generation after generation, sustained not by force or brilliance, but by the calm, unremarkable power of repetition, until the story itself seemed less like a sequence of events and more like a long, unbroken breath, quietly held and never quite released.